Take me to another place where the fairy tales don't end. Magical land. To another place where the fairy tales don't end. Magical land.
Today's show is another special XYZ Playground edition where I meet with Joshua Nuttall exploring how leaders of today can learn from leaders of tomorrow. Please welcome to the show with Joshua Nuttall. Hey Joshua, welcome back. How are you doing?
Jens, great to see you again. Thanks for making this a weekly occurrence now and no longer a prototype.
Yeah, I love it. I even changed the introduction, which is more towards like how leaders of today can learn from leaders of tomorrow, rather than always only saying XYZ Playground, which nobody of the listeners gets yet, but you will soon.
Yeah, you will soon, and I think it's a good tee up to some of the things that are in the pipeline at the moment, and some of the connections and dots that we're collecting and connecting, as you like to say.
Yeah. So today we put ourselves a topic which is mentorship. So how do you work with mentors and so on? But before we go into that, how did you experience mentorship in your life until today?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think quite a fascinating topic to be discussing today. And I think especially in the state that we find ourselves in the world, especially having not had a lot of human interaction and connection over the last couple of months, dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think a lot of people have been thinking exactly how do you connect with people digitally? What does that look like from a business perspective? And what does that look like from an individual perspective as well? So where I sort of started my thinking in preparation for this conversation was thinking right the way back to some of the experiences that I had when I was growing up. And while I might not have thought about it from a mentor perspective, it was definitely, I was guided by certain people through relationships, through sports teams, through academic achievements and things like that. And one of the examples that I'd like to go way back to is when I was 15 years old. And a sports coach specifically sort of singled me out. And at the time I thought, geez, this guy's being extremely hard on me. He's always pushing me to be better and giving me constructive criticism. But at the time I thought it was just criticism. And then one of the older players took me aside and he said, Josh, do you realize why the coach is doing this? And he said, it's because he knows and he believes in you and he knows that you can be better. And I think that that's a great way to, for me, and a lot of lessons inside of that space around the benefits of constructive criticism. And at the time, like I said, it was criticism, but it was definitely constructive. And reflecting on that some years later, I realized the impact that had on my life. And it's definitely played a pivotal role in helping me achieve many things that I've done today. And then sort of maybe taking a step forward is when I left varsity, and I had another mentor who's become a very good friend of mine now. And he said to me, start living in the now and stop worrying so much about how and what things are going to pan out in the future. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't live with a future plan in mind, but it means appreciate the now, work with what you have in your stable or right in front of you, as long as that's working towards your bigger picture of where you want to go. And I think those are two examples and mentor experiences that I've had so far that really sort of frame today's discussion from myself as a person. And hopefully I'll be able to share some insights around mentorship going forward. But yeah, Jens, that's a long answer from me. How about you? What mentorship experiences and people have you met in your journey as well?
Yeah, it's a lot of people, because I'm a little bit older than you. No, so the first story that comes in mind is when I was 16 and started my work career and then Germany has a specific educational system where you basically do a 3-year, or at least in my case, it was 3-year period where you work and you go to school at the same time. So it's like sometimes you go once per day into school and the rest of the week you work in a normal company and learning while you do it. So I've had, and he's today still a good friend. His name is Mike. He basically took a lot of youngsters under his wings at that time in that company. And specifically when you work with him on construction site or worked with him for on bigger projects, he basically has thrown you into responsibility even with you noticing. It's like you started in the company like 5 weeks ago. You have no idea what's going on. And he just said, and you're taking care of that today. Then you think like, yeah, but I have never done it. So how to do that? You will figure out. And that's over time that really merged into a friendship. And I learned so much on some like super basic things. Like he was like you said, he was very hard on us. And he was very hard on me as well. It's like swiping the floor every Friday to clean up the company building and this kind of things, which wasn't really necessary, but he was just saying that's a drill you need to do every Friday. And then we can meet up for having fun afterwards. But that's the thing you need to do, or cleaning the cars, all this like basic things to get into a routine. But as well, a lot of educational topics where he educated us, but just by pushing us, like we have had lunch break and he was asking us about different colors of different electronical topics. And it was like, oh, I don't need these colors ever in my life. But he was just pushing us to learn all of these things, which still, I know still some of the colors today. It's like, it's quite funny. And then, of course, I've had different mentors in different stages of my career. One mentor I'm still connected to and have a chat at least every 2-3 months is one of my big promoters of my career, who helped me to rebrand myself, helped me to understand how I can use my personal development in different ways, in different companies, in different jobs, and so on. That was and we have had, like, I was reporting to him in between and was not reporting to him. It was a great mentorship relationship, and it's still like a friendship mentorship relation where I learned so much from that person. Really, from a human perspective, from a business perspective, from like all different flavors, and that's really what it is about, having a relationship with someone you trust deeply, who helps you to dig into yourself, and then as well think about like nudging you into different directions to figure your way out. And I really appreciated that, and I also try to give that back when I'm mentoring someone, even if it is not an official formal mentorship relation where you say, hey, you are now my mentor. It's most of the time, at least for me, it happened naturally that a person was interested in who I am, and I was interested in a person who that person is, and then somehow it morphed into a mentorship relation. That's basically, as you say, long answer to that. But how was it? How was it for you? Have you been always chosen to be mentored, or have you chosen someone to mentor you?
Yeah, so I think, that's a fascinating thing to try and wrap your head around, is because I think in certain situations you'll come across a mentor who may, gravitate towards you, or you may gravitate towards them. But I'll use one example to sort of talk about my personal experience here. Is when I moved up to Johannesburg in end of 2014. To spend some time here and start my working career, is I had the opportunity to meet someone who's like I said, a close friend now, but also still a mentor, and his name's Carl. And one of the things that he really taught me about myself was around how to sort of trust yourself to do certain things. And Jens, you referred to it earlier in terms of being thrown in the deep end and having to figure a lot of things out. And more recently, where he's challenged me and he continues to challenge me, is around how do you actually think through things? Because there's certain ways that you think through things, or that you get taught to think through things, and that can sometimes be right, but it can also be wrong. And so inside of your own space and your own ability to think, you can then bring a different perspective to the party, and that leads to diversity and things like that. And so sort of to answer your question, is I've had the opportunity to work directly with Carl, and there were certain things that allowed us to meet and things like that. So that's sort of been a mentorship and a friendship that's developed out over time. And that's one example, is where I sort of had the opportunity, like I said, to meet him, and then I've worked with him in different sectors and forums going forward. But yeah, how about you? Have you had a process where you've selected young thinkers to come on board and mentor them yourself, and maybe also flip it around and say, when you were younger, were you put into situations where you had to engage with a mentor, or did a mentor reach out to you?
Yeah, I've had both, and quite interestingly, at least in my experience, like I've had some formal mentorship relationships where it was more you're part of a big corporation and they have like a mentorship program and so on. For me, this didn't work out ever in a long-term perspective. Of course, there was good interaction and I learned something and we built a relationship, but it never worked out in a way that it is naturally happening over a long-term, like long-term plus 5 years. So that's more the ones where like you said, like where you found each other somehow on an interest base, where you like the other person in a different way, and then you kind of merge into a mentorship relationship. That was always for me the strongest one. And same with me being a mentor for young people, or as well older people. It's not always one direction. We go into that later. Um, for me, the strongest relationships and the biggest development of the mentee I was mentoring was always when it was natural, was always when I felt deep interested. I was deeply interested into that person, understanding of where do they come from, really liking their edge. Yeah, because for me, it's often, and we have discussed that outside of this. It's like often it is you bring people together, or you like people who are similar to you. But it's also interesting to mentor people who are completely not as you are, because you learn so much as a mentor. So I've had a couple of, I mentored a couple of people who are like so different that I was like that's so hard to mentor them. But I was maybe I was learning more than they would be learning. It was quite interesting. But for me, it was really the informal setup, the informal getting towards a mentorship relation was always bigger impact in my experience.
Yeah, and I just want to maybe just double click on something then. It's a word that's kept recurring from both the words that I've been using and that you've been using in this conversation, and that's relationship. And I think, sometimes we think about mentorship and all of the things in terms of human interaction, and we don't necessarily understand the relationship between people. And that's something that, Simon Sinek, who's a great thinker and a motivational speaker and really a deep thinker on some of these topics, he has a fantastic saying where he says there are two ways to influence human behavior. So he says that you can either manipulate it or you can inspire it. And I think that then again talks to the relationship and how a mentor relationship develops. Because in a previous conversation, Jens, we've touched on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And I think that that's the beauty of a mentor and a mentee relationship in terms of how that can develop, and how as a mentor you can instill and inspire action inside someone so that they can actually do the work themselves. Because I think that's the beauty and the difference. You've touched on it in another conversation around the difference between mentoring and coaching. And I think that I just wanted to highlight the word relationship, because it's like I've said, it's come up a number of times in the conversation.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. And I think that's also the possibility where you go deeper into something. I mean, it's relationship for me, something that's way deeper than just surface. That means you trust each other. You tell each other things that you might not tell other people. And that then helps the other person to mentor you in a different way. And it's basically a snowball effect. When you build a relationship in that way, you go way deeper, and you basically you impact yourself and impact the other person in a way bigger way. Looking a little bit into reverse mentorship. So, I mean, one part we always think about in a mentorship way of thinking, that there's an experienced person mentoring an unexperienced person, and for sure in my life that was often the case, where I was either mentored by someone who is more experienced, or the other way around, that I mentored people who are less experienced than I am. But now we have looked as well, or found a new way of thinking about that, which is a reverse setting of that. So it's like a young person or an unexperienced person is mentoring an experienced person. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think firstly it's a fascinating concept, because it's flipping mentorship on its head in the traditional sense. Having said that, though, I think is when you start thinking about mentorship, maybe even before we go into reverse mentorship, is reverse mentor or mentorship rather is a bi-directional relationship. So I think that even experienced thinkers, when they're mentoring a younger thinker or a younger person, are learning a huge amount about themselves in the way that they communicate, but they're also learning how to interact with younger thinkers inside of that space, as much as the younger person is learning from the older person. Then moving on to reverse mentorship, and this is a fascinating concept, and it's something that, Jens, we've obviously spent a lot of time chatting about, and it's becoming more popular around the world. And it's basically saying, how can younger thinkers, so we'll call them the leaders of tomorrow, learn from the leaders of, or inform the leaders of today? And I think that when you start thinking and unpacking that, you're saying, how are we using the current leadership structures, so people who have experience and are in positions where they can drive change, and how are younger people getting connected to them? And that's the biggest thing that I find most exciting about that space, is because you're actually established leaders, existing leaders in positions of power inside an organization or company are connecting with younger thinkers and allowing their younger thinkers' thoughts to start informing some of the decision making that is being done now, so that businesses and companies of the future are actually being positioned better for the changing environment that the younger thinkers will live in 10 years' time, as an example.
Yeah. And the fun part of that is, at least in my mentorship relationships until now, it was often that I did that somehow, maybe not intentionally, and it was not set out to that. But I think it's even more interesting to find out if you do this intentionally, where you say, how I want to focus on that. I think then specifically the experienced thinker, the leader or the manager in an organization, will seek out for getting challenged, will seek out for new ideas, new ways of thinking, and that helps that person to completely do things in a different way. And I think that's a bit like this unleashing of new ideas, unleashing of new ways of thinking, which will lead to different activities inside a business, which I think specifically in the time where we are in today, where there are a lot of things happening in the world which are not always good. I think young thinkers have a very strong opinion of how they want to see the world in the future. And not everyone who is in power today, who is in a management position, has the same way of thinking. But it's crucial that they kind of try to understand and try to listen to that future thinking of the young leaders, because in the end, they will be either clients of them, customers of them, future employees of them, or whatever. So there need to be a connection between them, but it's just not naturally facilitated in today's world.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great point, and sort of, something that I'd just like to expand on there is around inside certain organizations and company structures, there have been programs that have tried to upskill and bring young thinkers onto, we'll use the analogy of a boardroom table. So you've got an executive, you bring in a young executive director who would then learn from the established thinkers. And I think a lot of things when you talk about execution come down to the how. And how does it actually happen? We can all have great ideas and think of what the future may be, but how are we going to get there? And I think just as much as young thinkers will be able to inform and challenge established thinkers inside of that space, the interaction and the learnings that young thinkers will get from interacting with experienced thinkers and established thinkers in today's age will help them build and lead better in the future. And I think that that's a big part. We mentioned it earlier about mentorship being bi-directional, is there will be an immense amount of learning from a young thinker's perspective as much as there will be from an established thinker's perspective inside of that, again, to use the word relationship, that will develop out in that space.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that, an interesting story. When I was younger, I was leading a fairly big global project in a company, and I was the youngest, and I was basically asked to go into the global board of that company to present something, and it was like, of course, scary for me, but it was a huge development step. And I think what would be interesting as well, doing that in the reverse. So a board member is going into a room with young thinkers and then have a discussion on different topics. And I think it would be the same learning curve and the same understanding of the board member going into a room with young thinkers and understanding their point of view of how they see the world and so on, like we touched already. Would be interesting to do a trial with that.
Yeah, and that that's it's again gets an idea running in my head around. So often when we as young thinkers engage inside specific forums, and again, we'll use the example of an executive boardroom, is that we have to be conscious of the way that we communicate, whether it be a type of language we're using, what points are we needing to hit inside the conversation, how are we listening, what feedback are we taking. And I think, flipping that table or that coin literally on its head and saying, put an executive into a round table that is consisting of young thinkers, there'll be an enormous amount of learning and great symbiotic relationships that will sort of develop from that and challenge the way that executives think. Because, if you take a marketing standpoint and strategy and thinking and that sort of things, people are now trying to connect with Generation Z because they understand that Generation Z are going to become a large part of their consumers going forward. And so then if you say, okay, if you take that into an organization and you say Generation Z are going to fulfill a large part of the workforce in the not too distant future, how are executives engaging and talking their language and communicating effectively in terms of the future that we can all build together?
Yeah, and I think it's in the same way valid for not business context. I think even in the private space, it's often, if you look into family structures, I mean, there are some cultures have very, very strong family structures where you're supposed to not to question what the elders are saying. And I think it's also in the world we are in, we need to allow this to happen. That's not saying that you should lose the respect, and I know that's very important in some cultures, but it's like more the way of truly understanding each other, truly listening to each other, because there's a huge difference in the way of thinking. And as you know, I'm, for example, spending a lot of time right now with my dad, and he has no smartphone. He's hating all the digital stuff, but he's curiously interested in what I'm thinking about this topic. Like I was, for example, he was doing radio clips a couple of years back when he was living in Spain from his work perspective. So now I was saying, it's like almost that's amazing. I'm running a podcast now, and that's like 10 years ago. So imagine podcasts would be available at that time in this sense. You could have established a podcast and could run your own show with what you have been doing at that time. And he was like, that's interesting. So I'm trying to digging out this old recordings, which he has somewhere on a CD. And I was already saying, like, I will put them someday on a podcast, just doing a special edition and sharing what cool stuff you have been telling at that time. So it's quite fascinating. If you open up these discussions, people will listen to each other in different ways. If you just fuel the curiosity around these topics, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, amazing. And I love that concept in terms of, fueling the curiosity, but then also creating the connection. And there's a famous Silicon Valley coach and a mentor, Bill Campbell. The reason I was just looking on my phone quickly is because that sparked a memory inside of my head. Is Bill Campbell, obviously he's no longer with us, but one of the things is that people had this engagement with him and took, exactly like you're mentioning, Jens, recordings, radio clips, and started to create this journey of his story and the engagements that he had. And I think that that's a fascinating space because it allows us, like we're just doing right now, is connecting over Zoom to record a podcast on different corners of the world. And, that's one of the things, again, that excites me about technology and the internet, is the ability that we have to connect with different people, with different mentors right around the world, to learn from different thinking and different cultures, etc. And that sort of leads me into just a off the cuff question, just around how do you think about mentorship in a digital age? Because I think it's quite interesting when you're in an office with a mentor, and you, even from a reverse mentorship, physical interaction is important. But what does that mean in this digital age that we're living in?
Yeah, in my experience, the digital world was there the last years already, but I think with the pandemic, it has rapidly changed how we interact. I mean, if we just take the two of us, we have never met in person. And I'm even not sure when we are able to meet in person with all the shit that's going on right now. but I think and in my experience, the of course all the mentorships I did, at least the initial thing and the initial the strongest bond was always done through physical meetings, through physical experiences we had together, meeting, chatting, meeting somewhere, traveling somewhere, spending time together in different settings. But I think we are learning to do that in a digital world. We are learning to adapt to do it in both worlds, which is physical and digital. Um, a lot of people are doing this now naturally on a day-to-day basis, like Zoom or any other platform is basically a normal way of connecting to each other. And I think that's also what's evolving in this mentorship relation. Because for me, there is most probably a difference when we meet in person, have a beer together or wine. But we have built up a relationship over the last 6 months that I would say I wouldn't be it's like if you look back, I wouldn't be saying that this can happen. But now with this digital perspective, I see it's possible. There's no problem at all having it. And I think that's something which is merging into a combined world of digital and physical. But I strongly believe that there needs to be a physical component into a long-term relationship, because the relationship will go way deeper. And I'm pretty sure for mentorship the same way. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's it's a great way that you framed that, Jens. And I think, maybe to build on some key elements that you mentioned, there's around it being a dual medium inside of that space. So I think that the last 14 months have taught us that we don't necessarily have to get into a plane to go and engage with someone on the other side of the world. But I do 100% agree that there is some physical element that does deepen a relationship going forward. And I think that we look forward to that day when we can have a beer or a glass of wine or bottle of wine together, rather, in some country around the world. But maybe to sort of unpack something maybe a little different and adding onto that digital environment and to ask the question is, mentorship, yes, it's bi-directional and there is a relationship element, but I think that we are getting to a stage in terms of where we can have a mentor relationship with simply the content that we're consuming. And what I mean by that is, if you think around the content that we have available, and we'll take podcasts as an example, we have the opportunity to learn from a number of thinkers outside our own four walls or physical environment that we engage with. And the way that the digital world opens up doors is quite remarkable. For example, you can message someone or connect with someone on LinkedIn or follow them on Facebook or go into a Clubhouse room and connect with them. And while there might not be that bi-directional feedback, you're getting a huge amount inside of that space. And the ability that digital connection has had, because if I use our relationship, for example, is had we not had Zoom and had we been living 20 years ago, the only way that we would have been able to meet would have been, by shooting faxes across the ocean to one another, or sending out emails and, connecting over the phone. And we would have to have gotten in a plane to connect with one another. And I think that that's something for me that it really is exciting about the digital space that we find ourselves in.
Love that way of thinking. I wasn't thinking about that at all. Because then you see, it's like I was just looking into, okay, who are the people I follow for a long time now? Like long for me means like plus 5 years, because that's like a relationship you have built up. And when I was studying before I started the podcast, was studying like what is the way of podcasting and what is the success of podcasting. It's basically building up a relationship with the person who is creating the show, which is only one directional. So because I don't know how many people are listening and who is listening and who is listening to what, but if you have someone who is listening to every episode or everything you're posting, they're kind of building up a one-sided relationship with you. And then if we just take one example, like I'm following, for example, Tim Ferriss since years. I've read all his books. I really like what he has created over time. And I mentioned that already in one of the other podcasts. So that's just one example. Or for example, I know that you're following Naval, Ravikant as well, and I'm following him as well. So they're definitely influencing our ways of thinking, which a mentor in the ordinary understanding would be doing as well. And I think that's also, I mean, influencers and mentors. What is the difference? What is an influencer? And it's quite interesting if you dig into that. Maybe influencers could be mentors in a way. I don't know. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for young thinkers as well to go out into the world and say, hey, that's my opinion, because that's also not culturally everywhere possible to put out your opinion. But I think that's something as well. When we looked into the reverse mentorship module and the things we do in the XYZ Playground, is how do you empower people to learn that, putting your opinion out? Because only if you put your opinion out, if you have a discussion with different standpoints, with different views, you can start a communication, an engagement, which goes deeper. If you always agree on everything, it's getting boring. So you need to have things where you don't agree and where you can learn from the other person and the standpoints of the other person.
Yeah. And I think, maybe just building off something that you mentioned is trust. And I think, it's one thing for a mentor and a mentee to trust one another. But I think one of the biggest parts that I've certainly experienced personally is for a mentor to upskill and to teach a mentee to trust themselves. Because I think when you start trusting yourselves and you start trusting your judgment, not to say that you're going to fall over and you're going to fail and you're going to make mistakes. That's going to happen naturally, and that's part of life. But to develop that trust element inside of yourself, I think is a big part of a mentor relationship that is quite pivotal in terms of that structure. And then going back to your question, I think we'll have to have another discussion on that, because I know that we're running tight on time. But the difference between influencers and mentors. And if you look at what Instagram just launched, and that might date this podcast a bit, but around their rooms, they're allowing now influencers to gather and build out that trust with more than one person inside of that space. So it's a fascinating concept to get our heads around at a future stage.
Yeah, love that. Let's write it down and see if we can dig into that the next couple of podcast episodes. So yeah, thank you very much for being on the show again. It's a pleasure to creating something which is not the ordinary part in my podcast show. So I think it's a good disruptor. Now, I still try to figure out what the listeners are saying. So if you're listening or watching this, please fill in your thoughts, chat with us. Let us know if you like it, if you don't like it. Like it and share it if you like it. Subscribe to it, and hope to see you again in next week in the next podcast episode around the XYZ Playground, where we look into what leaders of today can learn from leaders of tomorrow. Thank you very much, Joshua, and see you next week again.
Thanks, Jens. Keep on.
Take me to another place where the fairy tales don't end. Magical land. To another place where the fairy